I had been Sal's whole world for 19 days before the second wave came. And in 19 days, I learned that a child's trust is built the same way a tourniquet is built. Slow, deliberate, check twice, because if it fails all at once. We held Garnet Hollow, the last manned relay before the reach went unmapped on the survey charts. 6 of us, and a medical bay built into the bones of an old mining shaft, sunk 40 meters under rock that didn't care what was happening above it. I was the only medic for half a continent, which meant I was also the one who kept the emergency channel open around the clock, listening for the kind of silence that means someone needs you and doesn't know how to ask. That was how I found her. Not rescued, found. Crouched in the collapsed half of Tunnel 4, arms locked around her knees, her skin gone the gray of wet ash, 3 days after the first wave had passed through the surface camp and taken everyone who hadn't gotten underground in time. She didn't speak our language, and I didn't speak whatever low, clicking thing was hers, so we built something else instead. I learned that she liked the seam of light under the supply door better than the overhead lamps, and that she would drag her bedroll into that thin gold stripe every night without being told. I learned she counted on her fingers when she was frightened, all the way to 9, then started again, as if 9 were the only number her hands trusted to hold steady. I learned the particular stillness that meant she was listening to something I couldn't hear, a held breath, a tilt of the head no wider than a coin, and I learned, on the 9th day, to trust that stillness more than my own ears, because twice, it had told her things about the tunnels that turned out to be true. The second time, it kept Okonkwo from putting his hand through a gap in the rock where something with too many joints had been nesting. He hadn't believed her either, the first time he saw her go still and point. None of us were good at believing her yet. We were all still learning. The siren that woke us on the 19th night didn't sound like the first one. The first wave's alarm had been a probing thing. 3 short pulses, gone almost as soon as it started. Scouts, Command had said afterward. Just scouts, feeling out the edge of a colony before deciding whether it was worth the cost. This one didn't stop. It climbed and climbed, the long continuous howl that meant the scouts had reported home, and home had decided yes. Sergeant Lena Pell sealed the outer hatch herself. I watched her go up the ladder with the manual crank slung over her shoulder, told her I'd hold the inner door until she signaled, and she gave me the short nod she always gave when she meant it's handled. Don't ask me twice. Then the hatch above us boomed shut, and the comm channel filled with static, and I took Sal's hand and walked her down into the medical bay, where the other 4 were already sitting against the wall with their backs to the rock. The way you sit when you've decided the ceiling is the only thing left to trust. For 2 hours nothing happened, which is its own kind of unbearable. Then the intercom crackled, and Pell's voice came through clear as a bell, saying my name. Calder, Calder, open up. I'm hurt. I need you down here. I had my hand on the lock before I'd finished thinking the thought. That's what 19 years in this work does. It builds reflexes faster than judgment, and judgment has to fight its way back in after the fact. What stopped me wasn't training. It was Sal. She had gone rigid beside me, both hands pressed flat over her own ears. Not the gesture of a frightened child, but something more exact. The way you'd flinch from a sound pitched wrong, a string tuned a half step off from true. She looked up at me and shook her head, once, hard, and pointed not at the door but at the air around it, as if the wrongness was something she could see hanging there. I had read the survey notes on what we were dealing with. The species that came with the long dark wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Culled out, or driven off, 2 generations back, before any of us currently breathing had been born. They had throat sacs that could hold a sound the way a cup holds water, replay it note for note, but they couldn't replay the thing underneath the sound. The marrow hum, the survey teams had called it, the low resonance a living throat makes, that no recording, no mimicry, can quite forge. Sale could hear that hum. I couldn't. So I did the only thing that made sense. I trusted the child over the voice of the woman who'd taught me how to set a bone. I keyed the comm and said, Command authentication, full sequence, now. Pell's voice on the other side hesitated exactly 1/2 second too long, then gave me 4 of the 5 words right and stumbled on the last. A password command rotated weakly, precisely because nothing on the other side of a hatch should ever be trusted to remember it twice. I did not open the door. One of the other 4, Okonkwo, young, good with machinery, terrified in a way that made him reckless, got up and went for the lock anyway, said she's hurt, called her, you can hear it's her, and I put my body between him and the wheel, and told him the same thing I'd have told myself an hour earlier if I'd had the sense to listen. That love is not proof, that the voice we miss most is exactly the voice something hungry would learn to use against us, and that holding the line wasn't a failure of feeling, it was the feeling, aimed somewhere it could survive. He sat back down. None of us spoke for a long time after that. They came through the feed line 40 minutes later, not the hatch. 6 segmented bodies pouring out of a duct meant for nothing wider than a coolant hose, plated and patient, moving like they had all the time we didn't. I put Sael behind the surgical bed and took up the only tools within reach that weren't designed for killing, and made them lethal anyway. A bone saw, a pressure sealant gun loaded hot enough to cauterize, the portable autoclave's superheated steam line aimed and held like a weapon, because in that corridor, for those minutes, it was one. I am not going to describe what that fight looked like in detail. I will say that 19 years of knowing exactly where a body's weak places are works both ways, and that I used everything I knew, and that when it was over, there were things on that floor that did not get up again, and none of them were Sael, and none of them were any of the 4 people who had trusted me to hold a door I had no business holding alone. Dawn came the way it always does after the worst nights. Not gently, just inevitably, gray light finding its way down the shaft seam by seam, until the corridor stopped looking like a place where anything could still be hiding. The relief beacon answered our distress call 40 minutes after first light, and a recovery team cut the outer hatch and let real sun into a shaft that had forgotten what real sun was. Okonkwo went up first, then the others, blinking like men surfacing from deep water, and for a while none of us said anything at all, because there wasn't a sentence built yet that fit what we'd just come through. We found Pell near the crank wheel, where she'd fallen hours before her voice had ever called my name. Whatever had used her throat to ask me to open that door had taken the sound of her and worn it like a coat, and she had already been gone the entire time I was deciding not to listen to it. I sat with her a minute before the recovery team came to take her down. It felt owed. I carried Sael up the ladder myself, her arms locked around my neck, the way mine had once been locked around my own knees, in a tunnel I no longer remember the name of, and I told her, in the small handful of clicks I'd learned from her over 19 days, that I had heard her, that I would keep hearing her. It wasn't much of a vocabulary. It was enough. I think about Pell's voice more than I think about anything else from that night. Not because it frightened me, but because it had been built, note for note, out of every kind word she'd ever said to me, and they had used that kindness as bait, and it still hadn't been enough to get through. Some things, it turns out, can mimic a voice down to the breath in it, and still get the one thing wrong that matters. They can copy the sound of love. They have never once managed to copy what it costs to actually keep a promise. That part, I carried out of Garnet Hollow myself, the same way I carried her.